when desperate widow Margaret Holloway offered herself as a maid to feed her starving children. She had no idea that wealthy rancher Alexander Hartwell had been praying for exactly what she could give him. Not just domestic help, but the warmth of a real family to fill his empty mansion. But when dangerous men from Alexander's past threaten to destroy everything they're building together, will Margaret's courage be enough to save the home she never expected to find? Margaret Holloway's hands shook as she counted the 3 copper coins left in her worn leather pouch. All that stood between her children and starvation in the bitter Montana Territory winter of 1867. The abandoned barn where they'd spent the night offered little protection from the howling wind that swept across Silver Creek Valley, carrying with it the promise of an early snow that could trap them for weeks. 5-year-old Emma pressed closer to her mother's side, her small body trembling beneath the thin quilt that had once been Margaret's pride as a new bride in Ohio. 3-year-old James whimpered softly in his sleep, his tiny fist clutching the crust of bread they'd shared the evening before, their last meal in 2 days. Margaret studied her daughter's pale face in the gray morning light filtering through the barn's broken walls. Emma's blue eyes held a wisdom no child should possess, the kind that comes from watching adults struggle and fail. The little girl had stopped asking when Papa would come home 3 months ago, after Margaret finally found the courage to explain that heaven was too far away for visiting. "Mama, my tummy hurts," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind's mournful song. Margaret's heart clenched like a fist in her chest. She pulled her daughter closer, breathing in the scent of unwashed hair and childhood innocence that somehow persisted despite their circumstances. "I know, sweetheart. Mama's going to find us food today. I promise." The words tasted like lies on her tongue, but what else could she say? That their wagon had broken down 50 miles from nowhere? That the money from selling their Ohio farm had run out weeks ago? That respectable widows with children weren't exactly in high demand on the frontier? Margaret rose carefully, her joints stiff from sleeping on the hard-packed earth. Through a gap in the barn wall, she could see Silver Creek stretching along the valley floor like a ribbon of hope. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, and she could make out people moving along the main street even at this early hour. Somewhere in that bustling town, there had to be work for a woman willing to do anything to feed her children. She gathered their few possessions, a carpetbag containing their spare clothes, her husband's Bible, and the silver locket that had been her mother's, then gently shook James awake. The little boy's eyes opened slowly, confusion giving way to the patient acceptance that broke Margaret's heart anew each morning. "Are we going somewhere, Mama?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. "We're going to town, little man. We're going to find a new home." Emma took her brother's hand without being asked, and together the small family stepped out into the crisp morning air. Margaret had walked this path to town twice already since their arrival, but today felt different. Today carried the weight of last chances and desperate prayers. The mile-long walk to Silver Creek's main street gave Margaret time to rehearse the words she'd practiced in her mind. She was educated, capable, and willing to work. She could cook, clean, and manage a household, skills that had to be valuable even in this rough frontier town. The fact that she came with 2 small children would be a disadvantage, but surely someone would see past that to the value she could offer. As they crested the hill overlooking the town, Margaret stopped to catch her breath and prepare herself for what lay ahead. Silver Creek bustled with the energy of a place that had struck it rich. The silver mines in the surrounding hills had brought prosperity to some, while others came seeking their fortune with little more than hope and determination. Margaret recognized the feeling. Hope and determination were about all she had left, but perhaps they would be enough. They had to be enough because the alternative, watching her children waste away while she stood helpless, was unthinkable. She straightened her shoulders, smoothed Emma's tangled hair, and lifted James into her arms. Whatever happened next, they would face it together as a family. And maybe, just maybe, this strange town at the edge of nowhere would prove to be exactly where they belonged. The smell of fresh bread from Patterson's bakery made Margaret's empty stomach clench with longing as she walked Silver Creek's busy main street. James balanced on her hip while Emma clung to her faded blue skirt. Prosperous-looking men in fine coats discussed business outside the bank, their voices confident and well-fed, while women in silk dresses emerged from shops carrying packages wrapped in brown paper. Margaret had never felt her poverty more keenly than in that moment, surrounded by evidence of the comfortable lives that seemed as distant as the moon. Her own dress, though clean and carefully mended, marked her as clearly as if she wore a sign announcing her desperation to anyone who cared to look. "Ma'am, you look like you could use some help." Margaret turned to find a weathered man in his 60s studying her with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. His clothes were working man's garb, sturdy and practical, but his manner spoke of someone comfortable in his own skin. "I'm Ben Murphy," he continued, touching the brim of his worn hat. "Run the livery stable down the way. Couldn't help but notice you've been walking our streets for a spell, and those little ones look like they could use a rest." Heat flooded Margaret's cheeks. Was her situation so obvious that strangers felt compelled to offer charity? "We're just getting acquainted with the town, Mr. Murphy. Thank you for your concern." Ben's expression softened further. "Mrs. Holloway." "Margaret Holloway." "Well, Mrs. Holloway, if you're looking for work, and I'm guessing you might be, there's been talk around town. Alexander Hartwell's been having a devil of a time since his housekeeper up and left last month. Big ranch out in the valley. And word is he's getting desperate trying to manage that house and his cattle operation both." Margaret's pulse quickened. "Work. Real work, with wages and possibly a place to stay. Do you think that is, would Mr. Hartwell consider someone in my particular circumstances?" "Can't say for certain, but Hartwell's got troubles of his own from what I hear. Lost his wife 3 years back. Been rattling around in that big house ever since." Ben glanced meaningfully at Emma and James. "Might be that what you're offering is exactly what he needs, even if he doesn't know it yet." Before Margaret could respond, the bank doors opened and a tall figure emerged, his presence commanding attention even in the busy street. Alexander Hartwell moved with quiet confidence, his dark coat well-tailored despite the frontier setting. But something in the set of his broad shoulders spoke of loneliness that Margaret recognized from her own mirror. "That's him," Ben murmured. "If you're of a mind to try your luck, now's your chance." Margaret watched as Hartwell paused to speak with the bank manager, noting the respectful way other townspeople acknowledged him with nods and touched hats. This was clearly a man of substance and influence, exactly the kind of employer who might provide the security her children desperately needed. But would such a man want anything to do with a desperate widow and her hungry children? Emma tugged at Margaret's skirt. "Mama, is that man going to help us?" Margaret looked down at her daughter's upturned face, seeing hope warring with the fear of disappointment that had become too familiar. In that moment, Margaret realized she had reached the point where hoping hurt less than giving up. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said quietly, "but we're going to ask." As Alexander Hartwell concluded his business and turned to walk toward his horse, Margaret took a deep breath and stepped forward. Her entire future, and her children's, might well depend on the next few minutes. The thought terrified her, but terror was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not when Emma's thin hand slipped trustingly into hers, and James's weight reminded her that she was all they had left in the world. Would the stranger see past their desperate circumstances to the value she could offer? Or would he turn them away like so many others before him? Alexander Hartwell froze mid-step when he heard the woman's voice call his name, something in her tone cutting through the morning bustle of Silver Creek's main street like a church bell through fog. He turned slowly, his businessman's instincts immediately cataloging details. The careful way she held herself despite worn clothing, the protective stance around her children, the intelligence burning in green eyes that had seen too much hardship too young. "Mr. Hartwell?" Margaret's voice carried the refined accent of education, though her hands told a different story of recent hard labor. "I'm Margaret Holloway. I understand you might have need of household assistance." Alexander found himself studying her face more intently than politeness allowed. Something about this woman stirred a memory he couldn't quite place, like a half-remembered dream that lingered at the edges of consciousness. Her dignity in the face of obvious desperation reminded him of someone, or perhaps of something he'd been missing without realizing it. "Mrs. Holloway," he replied carefully, noting how her children flanked her like small soldiers. "I should be direct with you. The position requires someone who can manage a large household independently. The ranch is quite isolated and His gaze fell to Emma and James. I'm not certain my home is suitable for young children. Margaret's chin lifted slightly, and Alexander caught a glimpse of steel beneath the velvet politeness. I assure you, sir, my children are well-mannered and wouldn't interfere with my duties. I can cook for large groups, manage household accounts, and maintain a proper home. My late husband was a minister in Ohio. I know how to handle the responsibilities of a substantial household. Was a minister? The question slipped out before Alexander could stop it. Consumption took him last spring. Margaret's voice remained steady, but Alexander noticed the slight tremor in her hands. I can provide references from our congregation if you require them. Alexander felt an unexpected tightness in his chest. He recognized the controlled grief in her voice, the way she held herself together through sheer force of will. It was the same battle he'd fought every day since losing his wife Sarah to childbirth fever 3 years ago. The position includes room and board in the main house, he heard himself saying, the words emerging without conscious decision. Private quarters, naturally. The wage would be $15 monthly. Margaret's eyes widened. The amount was more generous than anything she dared hope for. That's very kind, Mr. Hartwell. I have my reasons, Alexander said, adjusting his coat as curious townspeople began to stare. Can you start immediately? Yes, sir. We're ready to work. As Alexander watched Margaret gather her children with quiet efficiency, he wondered what had prompted his sudden generosity. The practical side of his mind cataloged the benefits. She was clearly educated, experienced with household management, and desperate enough to be reliable. But something deeper had influenced his decision, something that had nothing to do with business sense. The ride to the ranch passed in comfortable silence, broken only by Emma's occasional questions about the countryside and James's sleepy observations from his mother's lap. Alexander found himself stealing glances at Margaret, noting how she pointed out interesting sights to her children despite her own exhaustion, how she maintained an air of wonder for their sake even though worry lines creased her forehead. When the Hartwell Ranch came into view, Alexander heard Margaret's sharp intake of breath. The main house rose from the valley floor like something from a fairy tale, 2 stories of carefully fitted logs and native stone, with a wraparound porch that caught the afternoon light like a welcoming embrace. It's beautiful, Margaret whispered, and Alexander felt an unexpected surge of pride. My father built it for my mother when they first settled here, he explained, then immediately regretted the personal revelation. She wanted something that would feel like home even on the frontier. Margaret nodded, understanding flickering in her eyes. She succeeded. But as they approached the house, Alexander's stomach tightened with familiar anxiety. The building that had once been filled with his mother's laughter and his father's booming voice now stood like a monument to loneliness. How could he explain to this woman that he'd hired her not just for her skills, but because the silence of his empty home had begun to feel like a living thing that followed him from room to room? Your quarters are here, he said, leading them through the kitchen to a comfortable suite of rooms. I thought it best for you to be close to your work area, but you'll have complete privacy. Margaret surveyed the space with the critical eye of someone who understood the value of every comfort. The rooms were well appointed but clearly unused, as if Alexander had prepared them for guests who never came. It's perfect, she said simply, and Alexander felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. That evening, as Margaret prepared their first meal in his kitchen, Alexander found himself drawn to the doorway by sounds he'd almost forgotten. The quiet bustle of domestic life, children's voices mixing with the gentle clatter of dishes and the soft humming of their mother as she worked. Emma looked up from her careful coloring and studied him with the direct gaze of childhood. Mister, are you lonely in this big house all by yourself? Emma, Margaret warned gently, but Alexander raised a hand. It's all right. He crouched to Emma's level, surprised by how natural the gesture felt. Yes, sometimes it gets very quiet here. We're quiet too, James offered seriously. Mama taught us to be quiet so we don't bother people. Alexander felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. You wouldn't bother me, he said, the words carrying more weight than he'd intended. When Margaret turned from the stove, her eyes meeting his across the kitchen, Alexander saw his own recognition reflected there. They were both refugees from loss, seeking shelter in the most unlikely of places. But before the moment could deepen, before he could examine the unexpected warmth spreading through his chest, the thunder of approaching horses shattered the evening's peace. Alexander's blood chilled as he recognized the riders silhouetted against the dying light. Bartholomew Kane had found another excuse to visit, and Alexander knew with grim certainty that his brief taste of domestic tranquility was about to be tested in ways he hadn't anticipated. The kitchen window exploded inward as a rock crashed through the glass, sending Margaret diving to shield her children from the shower of sharp fragments that glittered like deadly stars across the wooden floor. Emma screamed, and James began to cry, their terror cutting through Margaret's heart like a physical blade as she pulled them against her chest. "Stay down," Alexander commanded, his voice deadly calm as he moved to the window, his hand resting on the rifle he'd grabbed from above the mantel. Kane's brought friends this time. Through the broken window, Margaret could see 6 riders arranged in a rough semicircle around the house, their faces hidden in the shadows of their hat brims. But their intentions were clear enough. This wasn't a social call, and the rock through the window was just the beginning. Alexander Hartwell. The voice that boomed across the yard carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You and I need to have ourselves a conversation." Alexander's jaw tightened. "That's Bartholomew Kane," he said quietly to Margaret. "He's been trying to get his hands on this land since before my father died. Claims there's an old debt that needs settling." "Is there?" Margaret asked, her arms still wrapped protectively around her children. "My father never mentioned any debt to Kane," Alexander replied grimly. "But Kane's got the kind of lawyer who can make papers say whatever he wants them to say." Another rock crashed through a different window, this one in the front parlor, and Margaret felt her children flinch against her. The casual violence of the act, the willingness to terrorize innocents to make a point, told her everything she needed to know about the kind of men they were dealing with. "We need to get you and the children out of here," Alexander said, but Margaret shook her head. "Where would we go? They've got the house surrounded, and it's miles to town." She looked at Emma and James, saw the fear in their young faces, and felt something fierce and protective surge through her. "Besides, I'm not running anymore." Alexander stared at her, something shifting in his expression. "Margaret, you don't understand what you're getting into. Kane doesn't make idle threats." "Neither do I," Margaret replied, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "These children have been through enough upheaval. We're not running from another home." Before Alexander could respond, Kane's voice echoed across the yard again. "I know you're in there, Alex, and I know you got yourself some new company. Be a shame if innocent folks got caught up in our business." The threat was unmistakable, and Margaret felt ice form in her veins. Men like Kane wouldn't hesitate to use her children as leverage, she realized. The safety she'd thought she'd found was already slipping away, replaced by a danger she hadn't seen coming. "What does he want?" she asked quietly. Alexander's expression darkened. "Half my land, supposedly to settle this mysterious debt. But what he really wants is to control the water rights that run through my property. Without them, the smaller ranchers in the valley would have to sell to him or watch their cattle die." Margaret nodded, understanding flooding through her. This wasn't just about money, it was about power and the willingness to destroy lives to seize it. She'd seen men like Kane before, men who took what they wanted because they could, because no one was strong enough to stop them. "You got 5 minutes to come out here and talk like civilized folks," Kane shouted. "After that, we might have to get creative about getting your attention." Alexander checked his rifle, his movements efficient and practiced. "I have to go out there. If I don't, they'll keep escalating until someone gets hurt." "You can't face 6 men alone," Margaret protested. "I don't have a choice." Alexander's eyes met hers, and Margaret saw something there that made her breath catch. Not just determination, but a kind of peace that came from making a decision he could live with, even if it killed him. "Take care of the children. If something happens to me, There's money in the safe behind the painting in my study. Enough to get you and the little ones back to Ohio." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Alexander, wait." He paused, his hand on the door handle. "When you go out there, remember that you're not alone anymore," she said quietly. "We're here, and we're not going anywhere." For a moment, Alexander's composed mask slipped, and Margaret saw the man beneath the careful control. Someone who'd been carrying his burdens alone for so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand with him. "Thank you," he said simply, then stepped out onto the porch to face whatever waited in the darkness. As the door closed behind him, Margaret pulled her children closer and began to pray, not just for Alexander's safety, but for the strength to protect the home they'd only just found. Because somewhere in the space of a single day, this ranch had become more than just a place to work. It had become the place where they belonged, and Margaret would fight to keep it. The gunshot that split the Montana night sent Margaret's heart hammering against her ribs as she pressed Emma and James deeper into the corner behind the kitchen table, their small bodies trembling like frightened rabbits. Through the shattered window, she could hear Alexander's voice, steady and controlled despite the chaos erupting around the ranch house. "That was a warning shot, Kane. The next one won't be." Margaret peered carefully around the table's edge, catching glimpses of the confrontation unfolding in the moonlit yard. Alexander stood on the porch steps, his rifle trained on the mounted figure of Bartholomew Kane, while 5 other riders had spread out in a wide circle, their own weapons glinting silver in the pale light. "Now that's no way to greet old friends, Alex." Kane's voice carried the mock friendliness of a snake before it strikes. "Especially when we brought you a present." One of Kane's men dragged a figure forward, a young man Margaret didn't recognize, his hands bound behind his back and his face bloody from what looked like a severe beating. The prisoner raised his head with obvious effort, and Margaret heard Alexander's sharp intake of breath. "Danny Morrison," Alexander called out, his voice tight with controlled fury. "What's the boy got to do with our business, Kane?" "Young Danny here works for the land office," Kane replied conversationally. "Been doing some research into property records for me. Found some mighty interesting papers about your daddy's dealings. Seems there's a few documents that might change your perspective on things." Margaret watched as Alexander's grip tightened on his rifle. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he kept his breathing steady despite the obvious threat to the young man's life. This was a man who understood violence but hated the necessity of it. "Let the boy go, Kane. Whatever you think my father owed you, it dies with him." "See, that's where you're wrong." Kane's voice hardened like iron cooling in winter air. "Your daddy borrowed money from my pa 20 years ago, put up half this ranch as collateral. Papers got lost in a fire, but Danny here found copies in the territorial records." Margaret felt her blood chill. If Kane had legitimate legal documents, Alexander's position was far more precarious than she'd realized. But something about the way Kane presented his claim felt wrong, too convenient, too perfectly timed. "Funny how those papers only turn up now," Alexander said, echoing Margaret's thoughts. 20 years after my father's death, just when silver prices make this land worth killing for." Kane's laugh held no warmth. "Timing's a peculiar thing, ain't it? But legal's legal, and I got the law on my side. Judge Patterson already signed the papers transferring ownership. All that's left is for you to clear out." Margaret's heart sank. Judge Patterson was known throughout the territory as a man whose decisions often favored whoever paid him best. If Kane had bought the judge's cooperation, Alexander's legal options had just vanished like smoke in the wind. But then Emma tugged at her mother's sleeve, her young voice barely a whisper. "Mama, the man on the horse is lying." Margaret looked down at her daughter in surprise. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "When Papa used to practice his sermons, he said liars always touch their faces when they tell big lies," Emma explained with the serious confidence of childhood observation. "The mean man keeps touching his nose." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. Emma was right. Even from this distance, she could see Kane's telltale gestures, the nervous tics that betrayed his deception. The papers might be real, but the debt they represented was almost certainly fabricated. Alexander, Margaret called out softly, hoping her voice would carry to the porch without alerting Kane's men. The contracts are fake. She saw Alexander's head turn slightly, acknowledging that he'd heard her, though he gave no other sign. But something in his posture shifted, a subtle straightening that spoke of renewed determination. I'll need to see those papers before I agree to anything, Alexander called to Kane. If the debt's legitimate, I'll honor it. But I want my own lawyer to examine the documents. Afraid that ain't how this works, Kane replied, and Margaret heard the edge of impatience creeping into his voice. You got two choices, Alex. Sign over half the ranch tonight, or we take the whole thing after you're too dead to object. The naked threat hung in the air like the smell of sulfur, and Margaret felt her children press closer against her. These were not men who would be satisfied with half measures or negotiated settlements. They had come here tonight to take what they wanted, and they would kill anyone who stood in their way. But as Margaret watched the standoff unfold, she noticed movement in the shadows beyond the circle of riders. Dark figures were creeping closer to the house, moving with the careful stealth of hunters stalking prey. Reinforcements were coming, but Margaret couldn't tell if they were friend or foe. Mama, James whispered, his small voice thick with tears. Are the bad men going to hurt Mr. Alexander? Margaret pulled her son closer, her mind racing. Alexander was outnumbered and outgunned, facing men who had no intention of leaving witnesses to their crimes. The mysterious figures in the shadows could be more of Kane's men, preparing to surround the house completely. But they could also be something else entirely, help arriving from an unexpected quarter, allies Alexander didn't know he had. Margaret found herself holding her breath, watching the shadows and praying that salvation might come from the most unlikely source of all. Because if it didn't, the home she'd found for her children would become their tomb, and the man who'd offered them sanctuary would pay for his kindness with his life. The thunderous sound of approaching horses from 3 different directions shattered the tense standoff as a dozen riders emerged from the darkness, their torches turning the ranch yard into a blazing amphitheater of flickering light and dancing shadows. Margaret's heart leaped with desperate hope until she realized these weren't Kane's reinforcements. They were townspeople from Silver Creek, led by Ben Murphy and Sheriff Davidson, their faces grim with purpose. Evening, Bartholomew, Sheriff Davidson called out, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years keeping the peace on the frontier. Mighty interesting gathering you got here. Mind explaining why you're threatening citizens on their own property? Kane's confident demeanor cracked like ice in spring thaw, but he recovered quickly, straightening in his saddle with practiced arrogance. Sheriff, good to see you. Just here conducting some legal business with Alexander. Got court papers that say half this land belongs to me. That so? Davidson dismounted slowly, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. Funny thing about court papers, they usually get filed with the sheriff's office for enforcement. Can't seem to find any record of papers concerning the Hartwell Ranch. Margaret watched from the window as Kane's face flushed red in the torchlight. The trap was closing around him, but cornered animals were often the most dangerous. She could see his men growing restless, their hands drifting toward their weapons as they realized their carefully planned intimidation had turned into something far more complicated. Maybe you should check your records again, Sheriff, Kane snarled. Judge Patterson signed those papers himself. Already did, Davidson replied calmly. Rode out to see the judge before coming here. Interesting conversation we had. Seems he never signed any papers about the Hartwell place. In fact, he was mighty curious about someone using his name to forge legal documents. The accusation hit Kane like a physical blow. Margaret could see him calculating odds, weighing options, trying to find a way out of the trap that was closing around him. But with a dozen armed townspeople surrounding his small group, his choices had suddenly become very limited. You're making a mistake, Davidson, Kane warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I got friends in high places. Friends who don't appreciate local lawmen interfering with legitimate business. Maybe so, the sheriff acknowledged. But tonight, the only business that concerns me is keeping the peace in my territory. And right now, that peace is being disturbed by armed men threatening a rancher and his household staff. Margaret felt a surge of gratitude toward the sheriff for his careful word choice. By referring to her and the children as household staff, rather than revealing their more vulnerable status, he was protecting them from becoming targets in Kane's desperation. Alexander stepped forward, his rifle still ready but no longer aimed directly at Kane. "Sheriff, I appreciate your timing. These men have been making threats against my property and the people under my protection." "That's so?" Davidson's eyes narrowed as he studied the bound figure of Danny Morrison, still held captive by one of Kane's men. "And I suppose that young fellow there volunteered to be tied up for your entertainment?" Kane's jaw worked silently as he realized how badly his position had deteriorated. The false papers, the kidnapped land office clerk, the armed intimidation. Any one of these could land him in territorial prison, and all three together made a compelling case for a hanging. "Turn the boy loose," Davidson commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Then you and your men can ride out of here peaceful-like, and we'll pretend this whole misunderstanding never happened." "And if we don't feel like pretending?" Kane challenged, but Margaret could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. Ben Murphy spoke up from his position near the barn, his weathered face hard as granite in the torchlight. "Then we stop pretending too, Bartholomew. This valley's got no use for men who threaten children and honest folks trying to make a living." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes as she realized what was happening. The townspeople of Silver Creek had come to their defense, risking their own safety to protect strangers they barely knew. It was the kind of community solidarity she'd only dreamed of finding, the sense of belonging that had been missing from her life since her husband's death. One of Kane's men shifted nervously in his saddle, clearly uncomfortable with how outnumbered they'd become. "Boss," he muttered, "maybe we should." "Shut up," Kane snapped, but Margaret could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening air. He was trapped, and everyone in the yard knew it. Alexander lowered his rifle completely, a gesture of confidence that spoke volumes about his faith in the men who'd come to his aid. "The offer stands, Kane. Ride out now and we'll call it a misunderstanding. But if you ever set foot on my land again, or threaten anyone under my protection, the sheriff won't be the only one you'll have to deal with." For a long moment, the only sounds were the soft nickering of horses and the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods that lined the creek. Then Kane jerked his head toward his men, a sharp gesture of defeat disguised as defiance. "Cut the boy loose," he ordered grudgingly. As Danny Morrison stumbled free, rubbing his bound wrists and trying to stand on unsteady legs, Margaret felt something settle deep in her chest, a sense of safety she hadn't dared believe in for months. These people, this community, had proven themselves willing to stand against injustice, to protect the vulnerable, to do what was right simply because it was right. But as Kane and his men rode away into the darkness, their retreating hoofbeats fading into the night, Margaret wondered if this victory was permanent or simply a temporary reprieve. Men like Kane didn't give up easily, and their next attempt might come when the community wasn't prepared to respond so quickly. Would the safety they'd found tonight last until morning, or had they simply delayed an inevitable reckoning?